So I think Ben, we're going for kind of Q&A as we fly through this. So I think we've probably got an okay number for people just to sort of shout out. If you want to just drop it into the chat, I'm going to keep sort of monitoring that as we go, and I'll sort of stop Ben if I need to fire some questions at him. Okay.
Yeah, that would be my preference, because we can do Q&A afterwards, but if something comes up while I'm going through the talk, then I would prefer that you just ask in the chat, and Michael can see if they're relevant, and if the timing is good, he'll just jump in and interrupt me, which is my preference to waiting until the end. So feel free to throw those questions at me. So do you see my screen? Are we good to start? Great. So we will be talking about templating for performance, and if there's time, there'll also be a reveal at the end. I wasn't sure that if this would be ready by now, but it's something that I'm very excited about sharing with you, and I think it is ready for at least a first preview. So the premise of this talk is as follows. So you've built a site for a client, and you followed your own best practices, your way of building the site. The development process has gone smoothly. Client's happy. You have them come into the CMS, you train them up, they add their content, and you launch the site. All is well, right? And a few months go by, let's say 3 months go by, and you come back to the site. Client has asked you to tweak a few things here and there. And as you're navigating the site, you kind of get the feeling, it's subtle, but you kind of get the feeling that things are not as zippy as before. You can't quite put your finger on it, but you just kind of get that impression. And then 6 months later, you come back. Client again wants a little bit of tweaking here and there, just simple stuff. But this time you really notice, okay, the site is sluggish. Like this is not how the site felt when you launched it, right? And in my experience, this is a common enough experience that things, when you launch it, everything's fine, and 6 months or 9 months or 12 months down the road, I don't know, it feels a bit sluggish. So what's going on here? What's changed, and what is causing this issue? So if we can rule out things like the site's not getting a massive amount of traffic, not more than it did when it launched. You're the only developer, so nobody else has been messing with the code. Running on the same hosting platform with the same VPS, same PHP version. Basically, everything is the same. So what has changed? Well, the only variable in this case is that the client has gone in and added more and more content over time, and rightly so. You've given them a CMS. So what happens when Craft, which is very good at dealing with lots of content, you can throw thousands or even hundreds of thousands of entries at it, it should work just fine. So what is happening in this case? Could it be that the best practices that you thought you were following are not, in fact, best practices? So we're going to look at the fundamentals of writing performant template code, and specifically element queries, which are database queries as well. And I think a lot of you will know what I'm talking about, because there's nothing extremely advanced going on here. It's pretty much, the basics of element queries. But some of you will know this already, and for some of you, this will be new. Even for those of you who know what I'm talking about, I get the impression from the sites and the template code that I've seen in the past that a lot of us kind of just take it for granted that Craft will take care of performance, and we don't take the necessary steps. Okay, enough talking. Let's look at what we've got here. So my slides actually are templates. So this is the first. On the left, we have like the output. And on the right-hand side, we have the source code of this output. And as we go, we'll be benchmarking all of the templates using the trusty debug toolbar. I hope you can see this down the bottom. Do shout if you can't, which I can pop open. And I get all these things, which we're going to look at in a moment. So what have we got? We've got Craft 3.5 beta, and I've got the debug toolbar enabled on the front end. This is an invaluable tool when you're developing a Craft site. It's useful to always have this on, even though it's kind of tucks in nicely out of the way, so we often don't see it. But I tend to like pop it out, and then it'll stay out for this session at least. So that's how you switch it on. Very easy. And what I've done for this site is I wanted to simulate like having a lot of content. Very often when we build a site, we have some dummy content. We might like create 10 lorem ipsum entries and think that this, this is how the site's going to be in the future. But obviously, as the client adds their content, which they will, the number of entries grows. So what I've done, I wanted to import or create 1,000 entries. And in addition to those entries, each entry is related to 1, 2, 3 other entries. So you can basically see that here, that each article is related to 3 other entries. And it was very easy to set this up. And I might just show it to you because I think it's worth knowing how to do this. So I have feedme installed. And I have a template. Oh yeah, I should mention all of these slides, which are actually templates, are available on GitHub in this repository, templating for performance in Craft CMS kebab case. Yeah. Let's look at that template though, because it's very simple and it's useful. It's handy to have this around, I find. I hope you can see it. Yeah. So I've basically set the total number of entries that I want 1,000. Per page is not so relevant here, and I've said I want 3 related entries for each entry. So I have an outer for loop where I loop over this range 1 to total, which is 1,000. I create an entry with the title article and this kind of index. And then I relate it using this related entries field. And then I have an inner for loop where I kind of loop over the range 1, 2, 3, in this case, related is set to 3. And this well, do I have it? Maybe I could show it to you. I think I do. Yeah, so it'll output this. I have a Chrome extension which prettifies this for me. And then feedme will just import this, and boom, in a minute you have 1,000 articles in the CMS, which is pretty handy, especially when you want to test with things like related entries, which is what we're going to primarily focus on today. Okay, we're using Nitro, which you may have noticed from my URL here. And Nitro is still in beta, but I think it's working great, and I'm using it for, I'm gradually migrating my development sites over to it. I'm enjoying it a lot. I think props to Jason McAllister and the rest of the Pixeltonic team. They did a great job on that. Okay, what else have we got? I think that's good. I think we're ready to start looking at code. Oh yeah, let me refresh this page. And what's important here is to get a baseline for the number of, well, not only database queries, just a baseline, right? We're not really executing any code here. We're just displaying this H1 tag. And what we can see down here is a number of things. What we'll mainly be concerned with, yeah, I just want to move that out of the way. What we'll want to keep an eye on here is obviously the time, the load time, and that's variable. Like it's not going to be ever like fixed. It's jumping around as I refresh, but it's going to probably be anywhere from 100 to 200 milliseconds, just based on my environment, my development environment. This will be variable. We want to keep an eye on the memory as well, the number of database queries. Those are the 3 kind of primary things that we want to keep an eye on. And you'll notice there are 18 database queries being executed. We could open this up and look at them, but they're not so easy to understand just from the raw SQL. But that may be surprising. 18 database queries just to output, this template which has a static piece of text in it. Well, that's just basically Craft setting things up in the background and checking, because I'm logged in. Obviously, there's probably an extra query to get the user element, to get all of the globals, all that stuff. But we can say, okay, so the baseline here is 18 database queries. The time is about approximately 1 to 200 milliseconds. Memory is 4.5 megabytes. I'm not going to remember all of these, so I might just keep this tab open. And there are 44 events. But these things here in blue are the primary things we want to keep an eye on. Okay, I've said enough. Let's move on. Okay. So what are we doing? We want to output 10 entries, the first 10 entries, and we're going to do this the poor way. We're going to use deprecated code. Deprecated code, what I mean by that is, if you're new to Craft, you may not know this, but in Craft 2, it was possible to output entries in a well, actually what we're dealing with here is an entry query, but it was possible in Craft 2 to just loop over that when you're outputting those entries. In Craft 3, it's still possible, but it is deprecated, and for good reason. We'll go into that in a bit more detail. And here I'm not using the limit as you normally would here. When I filter, I say, get me all of the entries in the section articles. And normally you put the limit here. I'm not doing that though. I'm doing it a pretty poor way. I'm doing it within the for loop. I'm saying if the loop index is less than 10, then output the entry's title. So what it ends up happening if we look down at our trusty toolbar is that we first of all get a deprecation warning. We can pop that open. It's saying that looping through element queries directly has been deprecated. We should use the all function. So back in Craft 2, you could use the find function, which you would put on the end of the, it was called an element criteria model. In Craft 3, this became required, although deprecated, and we use the all function. And this actually, if you didn't know, this is the reasoning that .all is called .all, because .all was introduced here in Craft 3 as a way to actually query the results. So we get this nice deprecation warning. What else do we want to look at? Well, look at our time. It's jumped quite a bit to almost a second, which is pretty poor. Our database queries, we got 11 queries just to output this, which is kind of surprising. And what I've got here is, this is the Elements panel plugin, which I just released a couple of weeks ago. And this is really handy, I think, because this shows us how many elements have been populated on a single request. And you see here, something's wrong. We've populated 1,000 elements. And what that means is that our memory has jumped up to 11 megabytes, which is a ridiculous amount of resources to output 10 entries. Also, our events, we're processing 3,074 events. How is that possible? Well, every time we populate an element, there's a bunch of events that get processed at the same time. So the fact that we're populating 1,000 elements means that we're also dealing with 3,000 events, which can't be particularly performant. And the reason for that is because we have not limited the entries that we're getting back through this element query. So let's deal with that. Let's same code, but we're going to actually move the limit from within the for loop up here where it should be. So now what happens is that we have 10 elements are loaded, and that's what we want. That's what we'd expect, right? When we're outputting 10 elements, we expect only 10 elements to be populated, and none of those are duplicates. So events have gone back to a reasonable number. Our time is not great. So let's look at our code. Let's look at what's going on here. We're showing 1,000 entries. That's obviously not right. So we're still using deprecated code, which means that we're looping over an entry query rather than the actual entries. So this is mislabeled. This shouldn't be called entries. It's very important with any code to label things what they actually represent. Otherwise, you get this situation where you might think these are entries. Let's loop over them, but in fact, they're not. So what's happening here is when we call length, this doesn't actually process this query and get us back the results and then call the length on it. It calls .count, and .count doesn't look at the limit. It just looks at this part. It excludes any limit. So we're just using bad code here, and we're getting results which are not making any sense. So we can fix that by getting rid of that deprecated code. So we will first of all name this correctly. This is an entry query, so let's name it what it is. And once we have that, we can say, okay, well, we're going to only show this piece if there are results. So if the count is non-zero, then we'll loop over the results of executing that query, which is the correct way to do it. And at the bottom, we're going to use .count. This doesn't quite solve it because, as I mentioned, .count will not look at the limit. But we have reduced the number of database queries from, I think it was 29 in the previous slide, to 23. So our baseline was, what, 18? So we've only got 5 database queries, which is acceptable. But how can we improve this further? So we're going to memoize entries, and memoization is not what it would sound like if Jonathan Ross said memorization. To memoize something actually means to store the result of a potentially expensive calculation for the duration of a request. In this case, with Twig, it basically means setting a variable, entries. So we'll process the entry query, we'll call .all on it, and we'll store that in this variable entries. And then every time we refer to entries, we don't have to re-execute that query again. So that saves us a single database query, woohoo! But it also cleans up our code. And it means that when we call entries length, that will now show 10, which is correct because we're calling length, the length filter, on an array. Right, so the big difference here to note is that entry query is a query which has not yet been executed. Entries is an array of entries, which is the result of executing the query. So that's why we get the correct result here. And again, when we call count, we know how this works, and we're actually we're getting the correct this correct effect, otherwise known as the Masuga feature. Okay, how can we improve this further? No, we're not going to improve it further. We did everything we could do. We're going to get a bit more complicated here, or complex. We're going to add a level of complexity. So here we're going to output article 1, and then we're going to output all of its related entries, right? Remember I showed you here, article 1 is related to 3 different other entries, and so on. If I'm going too fast and there are questions, just jump in, Michael.
No, all good. Perfect.
Okay. I tend to speak fast when I'm excited. I'm excited.
No, you're not. No, it's not fast at all. It's perfect.
Okay. So how do we do this? We're doing this 10 times. And we have our code from before. I say using deprecated code. We're still using the correct code from the previous slide. But inside our for loop, where we have to get the related entries, we're still doing this using deprecated code. That's why we have our deprecation error appearing down here at the bottom. The reason for that is entry.related entries is an entries field, right? It's a relational or a relationship field. So what this passes back to us is not an executed query or a set of related entries. What we get back from this is a query, an entry query. And by calling length on it, and then by looping over it, we're again falling back into this pattern of deprecated code. So we really need to be calling .all, .count, etc. So the result of this is that we have our deprecation error, but look at our database queries. We have 66 all of a sudden. We're loading 22 elements. That's fine. But we do have duplicates. 10 of those are duplicates. So we have, I guess we're loading, if we look at this, we have article 104, 104, 104. So we have these duplicates appearing. And for the first time, we have a warning here in the eager loading tab. I know I didn't say much about these. I can talk about them more later on. But what this tells us is that there are opportunities for eager loading elements, and those have been detected on this page. So basically this will scan, no, it won't scan our template code, but it will listen for related, what would these be called? Related element queries being executed. And it will tell us, okay, well, on using this field name related entries, there's an opportunity to eager load these 10 queries. 10 of them were duplicates. So basically the same or a very similar pattern was detected 10 times. And that makes sense because we're doing this within the for loop, which runs 10 times. So let's clean this up by fixing our deprecated code, otherwise known as using the correct element query methods. So here we have .count, as I pointed out previously, and .all. So what does that do? That gets rid of the deprecation errors. That's reduced our database queries. I think we had 66 previously. Now we have 50. The reason for that is because we weren't using these query methods. So it had to go execute the query multiple times. I think, yeah, at least twice. So just that little fix has saved us quite a few database queries. We still have this eager loading issue. So how do we deal with that? Well, first step, before we do that, let's clean this code up further. So we'll memoize this query execution, set it to a variable called related entries. And once we have that in a variable, we can reuse that multiple times. So here and here. So we don't need to process that query. Look at our database queries. That's dropped to 40. The reason we're getting such a high number here is because we have an order of n complexity. The more, and actually I would like to show you something out, what this means. So because we're looping over this 10 times, each time we enter this loop, we're creating more database queries. I have this thing here where I can set the limit, set it to 20. Okay, so now we're outputting 20. Now our database queries have jumped to 50. Let me set this to 100 just to issue. So now 130 database calls. So as I increase this limit, the number of database queries also increases linearly. So this is an order of n complexity problem. And we really want to avoid this situation because this is exactly that situation I was kind of alluding to in the beginning. As more content is added to the site, things will slow down. So we have 200 elements being populated on this page, which is causing the memory to jump to 11 megabytes. The time is almost 700 milliseconds. Thousands of events are being thrown. So not ideal, right? Far from ideal. So let's fix this up. And this is where eager loading comes in. And eager loading, if you haven't heard of it, this is going to change the way that you, hopefully change the way that you build sites. And if you have heard of it, that's great, but do you always use it? Let's look at the difference first of all. Well, let's look at the code and then we'll look at the performance. So basically what eager loading means is that rather than fetching related entries down here in the code, we can say, when you're fetching the entries with this query from the database, go ahead and also get us the related entries on each of these entries that comes back. What this looks like in the code then is that when we refer to entry.related entries, this is no longer an entry query as it was before, because we've said, fetch me these entries with with this field populated. What I actually get back here is an array of entries. So I already have the result for me. I don't need to calculate that. So I've got it here and I've got it here, and then I can just loop over them. But let's look at the database queries, 24. So that's like almost back to how it was when we didn't have these related entries. Huge difference. Memory is fallen back down. Time is much faster as well. So our eager loading warning is gone now. It sees that, okay, that's been resolved. Let's look at our elements. Yeah, no duplicates because it only fetches them once from the database. So that's fantastic. This is the ideal situation. We want to I guess to summarize what we've done so far, we've fixed up any deprecated code, right? We've memoized any calculations, the results of any calculations that we've made. So here, for example, we're just setting that into a variable and then reusing that variable around our template. And we're eager loading related entries. And this would be, this could also be, I'm talking about an entries field, but this would apply in the same way to categories, to assets, even to matrix blocks. Okay, let's make this a bit more interesting. We're going to, so I've switched from the entry titles to entry IDs, just so this would all fit in, otherwise this gets crazy long. So as before, we're outputting 1, 2, 3 related entries. And for each related entry, we're outputting its 3 related entries. Okay, so we've gone a bit crazy with inception. And I want to show you what this looks like without eager loading. So over here on the right-hand side, we've taken out the with statement. And as before, we're looping over the related entries. We're doing it correctly without deprecated code. But within this loop, we've got another for loop. We're calling this a cousin. So this will be the related entries of the related entry, in the current loop that we're in. And then we'll just output the ID. So we're kind of 3 levels deep. What does that do to our database queries? We've got 80 database queries, which is, I don't know how many, that's like, we started off with 18, so a huge amount more. We are, let's see, we are populating 36 entries, which is correct. That's everything we need, but 22 of those are duplicates. And the reason for that, well, we have opportunities for eager loading. We have these 22 queries, which we could eager load, and 20 of those are duplicates. So how do we deal with this? Well, the first step, let's go back to what we had before. We'll eager load the related entries. That means that here we can take, this is not a database query execution anymore, but this still is in here. So we've reduced that from 80 to 62. There's still opportunities to eager load, but they're down to 12. Oh, before I do that, let me just go back one slide. I want to show you this, what happens. Like, we're just looking at 10 articles, but I want to show you how extreme this order of n issue can be. Let's see if this hopefully doesn't crash. I'll set the limit to 100. It's loading. There we go. So it took 3.5 seconds. It's pretty long. 530 database queries, 305 elements are populated. I mean, these are crazy. And you could say, well, this is not a typical use case. But on the other hand, I mean, I could imagine, a listing of entries, and then you output the maybe the category, and then for the category, you output like an image for that category, or maybe there's an author or something. So it's not too out there. All right, so back to where we were. We cleaned this up by eager loading related entries, but we're still executing this element query. So how do we clean that up? Well, we can nest our eager loading. The syntax is very easy to do. We will say, so get me all of the entries with, so this is our first relationship, the related entries field. And this might look weird, but it's because we're using the same entries field, related entries. So this is saying, get me all of the entries along with their related entries, along with their related entries. And now this kind of reduces our code because we don't need to execute this query anymore. This is not a query actually anymore because we've eager loaded it. This is a set of pre-populated entries. We can loop directly over those. The output is the same, but let's look at our database queries, 26, and it's flying 178 milliseconds. So this is okay. So let's look at our elements. Let's go through this. Yeah, properly. 36, no duplicates, no eager loading warnings. The events are reasonable at 220. Memory is reasonable at 5 megabytes. So we've got a really performant piece of code. And the best part about this is if we've done this correctly, then we're no longer dealing with order of n complexity. We're dealing with order of 1. So we've got 26 database queries to output these 10. If I set them to 100, so crazy. Database queries 26. So that's beautiful, because it means that it doesn't matter how many entries we output. Order of 1 means it's not going to grow with that number. So as n grows, 1 doesn't grow. No, that makes no sense. But anyway, take my word for it. The number of database queries doesn't grow. We can populate 305 entries, 1 duplicate. That's interesting. I can't explain that, but it doesn't matter. We've still, got it loading pretty fast, considering how much we're loading. The memory is reasonable, considering that we're loading 300 entries. And there you have it. So eager loading is the best thing ever, combined with storing, not processing these query element queries multiple times. That's essentially what you're going for. You're not only reducing the number of database queries, but you're reducing everything else that goes along with that. Do I sense a question coming? No. Okay. So I'm not monitoring the chat, so if
there's
chat,
oh yes, yeah. Can the question be asked from Andrew Welch? Yes, go ahead. Why don't we just eager load everything if it's so great?
That's a good question. It's one I've often asked myself. Yeah, why don't we do that, and then we save ourselves the hassle of having to think about, well, what needs eager loading in here and change any code. So by default, element queries will be what's, I guess, known as lazy loaded. So it will load as little as possible. If I say get me the entries in this section, limit them to 10, it'll just get me the, how would you call them? I guess the simple fields, all of the text fields, all of the number fields, everything except for a relational field. If the default behavior was not lazy loading, but it was eager loading, then it would fetch everything for me. It would fetch the related entries, and I guess that would propagate down to this, and it would also fetch those. What would end up happening is that I would get a huge amount of data back. If we think about it, any asset field or category, tags, entries, users, what else we've got? Matrix blocks, even image transforms. Those are all stored in a different database table. And for that reason, they need to be fetched separately. And if we eager loaded everything, then this could just get out of hand. And say I just, like in this case, I just want the title and I just want an ID. I don't really care about how deep into all of the relational fields we go. So it's really a question of, what's more important? Is performance more important, or is giving you access to everything more important? And Craft has settled, or maybe even Yi, I guess, has settled on this model of lazy loading by default. And when you know that you need these kind of relational pieces of data, then you have to call out and get them explicitly. But it's a very good question, yeah, because I've often thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if this was automatically detected and we didn't have to say, with, like, maybe, Craft could parse our templates and see, okay, well, I'm going to be using related entries, so why not just prefetch that? Maybe that's a plugin to be made, Andrew. Okay, so if any other questions come up, just do interrupt me. That's pretty much the bulk of my slides here. I want to point you to a few things. If you're not familiar with this page in the Craft 3 docs, please do read it. It's an okay read, and it's very important to understand not only how this works, but also how easy it is to implement. So with this width parameter, we can pass in an array, so we can eager load multiple sets of elements. We can nest our sets of elements as we did in the previous slide. We can fetch our matrix blocks because, like I said, those are also kind of relational. Yeah, those are called through element queries as well. There is one little gotcha here with matrix fields. You need to put in the block type name, block type handle, then colon and the field handle if you want to eager load that. And even things like, so here's, I guess this would be an asset, an image, and then even transforms, because those have to go out to a different database table, we can eager load those as well. So what ends up happening with this is that we execute, well, I want to say one query. It's not exactly one query, but it's going to be order of one. So it may be 2, it may be 3, it may be 4, but that's not going to change depending on how many entries we have. We eager load that, and then there are no subsequent database calls, which is really the ideal situation we want. So there is this situation where we have auto-injected elements. So when I navigate to an entry page, that entry is auto-injected into that page, right? We know that because you can access the entry variable. And in that scenario, I mean, how do you eager load? Because it's already pre-populated. So there is a way to do this. I've actually never found myself having to do this. If you're really into performance and you're not using caching of any type, then maybe this is worth it. I don't know. This is how you do it natively in Craft, though, which isn't very pretty, but it works. And I think it's in the docs. I'm not even sure if it is. It must be somewhere. And then there is the Eager Beaver plugin, which made this possible in Craft 2 before it was possible in Craft 3. And the syntax is really just much cleaner and nicer and easier to read. And that's by NY Studio 107. And then there's the article Speed Up Your Craft CMS Templates by Andrew Welsh. And that's a 5-minute read, which goes without saying.
Ben, there's another question in the chat. This one's from Sean.
Great, I can take a breather.
Regarding eager loading, is there a way to sort/order the returned array?
Oh, good question. Let's see. So, for example, sorting this, I guess. So because obviously we can, let's see, we can order our articles however we want up here. We would just add .order by. But can we sort these, the 203, so these related entries? That's a very good question, Sean. And it's one that I'm going to have to get back to you on because I don't know the answer. My feeling is that the answer is no. At least not here with using the width parameter. Maybe somebody can correct me. So I think the answer is no, but I would have to look into that for you. Good question. Very good question. Yeah, it's a very good question because how do you do that?
I believe it is possible, actually. Because I believe you can add a criteria to the width to be able to either filter or sort that those eager loaded entries that you're bringing back.
So in here, when you're specifying what should be eager loaded.
That's right, and I'm just trying to think if I can find an example for that.
Yeah. Well, that would be news to me, but that'd be cool. Oh, here we go. Yeah. This looks like it might be what you're talking about. So you can define custom parameters on the eager loaded element.
So you can stick an order by in there, and then that will sort.
That's right. Yeah, I've used this as a filter before, but you're right. Yeah, why not just an order by? Yeah. So that's good. Yeah, that's why I think more of us need to study this page in the docs, because I think we kind of skim over it. We go, oh yeah, I know what that means, and we don't go beyond eager loading multiple sets of elements or something. But yeah, that's kind of cool, because you can, in theory, put any parameters on here, which will then get applied onto this eager loading element query. Yeah, that's very cool.
The other thing you mentioned on that debug bar was that elements panel. Is that's a sort of plugin that you've got installed? That's your own plugin, did you mention?
Yeah, well, that takes us to slide number 13. Thank you, Michael. But yes, that's something that I put out a few weeks ago, and this was actually inspired by something I saw in Laravel, and I thought, well, yeah, and it wasn't. They obviously don't use elements. But I think it was models, because they populate models in eloquent models in Laravel. And I thought, well, yeah, we need this in Blitz, not in Blitz. I'm reading off the screen. We need this in Craft as well. And I thought, well, while I'm at this, I might as well add the eager loading, because if I'm already detecting elements being populated, then I can also inspect the query very easily. But this is very easy because Craft has so many events all around the code base. It's very easy to listen. I think this one is, well, I don't remember what it's called, but something like on an element populated or something like that. So I'm basically just listening for that event. Let me just jump back to a slide that actually has this populated. 1,000 here. So I'm just kind of listening for that event, and when I see that event, I'm incrementing this number. In addition to that, I'm also storing the ID of that element, and then on all subsequent calls to or triggers of that event, I'll keep incrementing this. But if I notice that the same ID is being populated multiple times, I'll increment the number of the duplicates as well. And that way, there are some cases. Let's see here, maybe, yeah, where you see 22 elements were populated. And you can see this quite easily here, how 10 of those are duplicates, because there's 104, 104, 104. Yeah. So the nice thing is, when we eager load elements, we eliminate this situation of duplicates, because they're just loaded once, essentially, populated once, I should say. But yes, that plugin is it's still in beta, because the logic behind it is quite simple, and I just haven't had the chance to. I have it running on all of my sites, obviously, but I haven't had the chance to get much feedback. But yeah, that's available. That's on GitHub. It's not yet in the plugin store because it's in beta, but it's composer require. Put your lights on, Craft elements panel. You got to do this beta thing, and you install it, and off you go. It just appears, and then that brings me to the Blitz recommendations plugin. And a quick note about the naming here. So this was originally going to be a feature in Blitz where it gives you recommendations when it notices that you can add performance to your templates, mainly through eager loading, but other means as well. And I was kind of playing around with the idea of, do I want to just bake this into Blitz, or do I want this to be available to everybody? And I went with the latter. So it's actually a free plugin. It will work with Blitz, but also without. It's just that naming things is hard. I didn't want to come up with a new name, so I was like, I'm just going to call this Blitz recommendations. Oh, but let me show you what that actually does, because you have no idea. So I'll jump over to utilities, and worth noting when this loads, here in deprecation warnings, all of those deprecation warnings that we saw in the debug toolbar will also appear here. And that has a little badge next to it with the number. So I'll often come into other people's sites if I'm helping with maintenance or troubleshooting, and I'll see warnings in here. My first thought is, you got to clean those warnings up. And it's usually, sites that were migrated from Craft 2 up to Craft 3, and the template code wasn't fixed up. But those, even those deprecation errors add database queries. So yeah, clean those up. There's no excuse, because in most cases you're given the exact line number and the template, so you just need to go there, add the .all, and you're done. But here's Blitz recommendations. It also has a badge which tells you how many, in this case, warnings, no, recommendations there are. And what we get here is very similar to the deprecation warnings. We have the exact template on which this happened, and it's telling us you can eager load the related entries field. So similar to what we saw with the Elements panel plugin. The difference here, though, is that you don't need to be navigating the site logged in with the debug toolbar on. As people navigate your site, these warnings will, or these recommendations will be logged here, and anytime you log into the CMS, you'll see them. A little bit of info. It's telling you what to do, basically saying, it's trying to be smart about this. We'll see. It's saying use the width parameter. This is kind of a general guideline of how to solve this issue. It's telling you the name of the field, and it's even kind of giving you the code to fix it up with, which isn't exactly right. I mean, you might have other things, but it'll get you halfway there, and then a link to the docs. So if you're sitting through that talk thinking, oh, that's great, Ben, that's really great, but time is finite and I've moved on to better things, well, you can just install this plugin and come back a week later and see how many warnings you have, and then go fix those up. So you don't necessarily have to go through each template with the debug toolbar open, trying to catch those issues. Yeah, that's all I got for templating for performance.
Awesome. That was great. Thank you very much. So in terms of, so you mentioned looking at the time, the memory, the database. Is there one of those that you kind of think of is the sort of thing you home in first? Is it kind of database queries that you try and get down before anything else?
Yeah, I mean, database queries aren't the only thing that slow down the page load. It's really a combination of all of these things. I can't say it's one or the other. Like if you have 20 database queries, but the page load is 2 seconds, something's wrong, right? Or if the page, well, that's not going to happen. I was going to say if the page is loading very fast, but the memory is very high, that's not likely to happen. But like we had a few examples here. Was it slide 7? Let me see. I think it was 7. No, 8 or 9. I don't know. Anyway, but if we look here, we see, okay, like very often if the database number of database queries is high, that will be reflected in the time because database queries take time, but also the memory, because we'll be often populating lots of elements. Now that I have this plugin, I'll be looking at all of these, right? All these, so time, memory, database, elements, eager loading. I mean, time is not like in a production environment, this page won't take 422 milliseconds, right? What do I have? I guess I have Xdebug switched on, and I have dev toolbar open, and I have dev mode switched on. So time, just going by time, is you should take that as an indication. For example, when I see 422, and then I go to the next slide, and I see 800, so it doubled. That tells me something. So it's all kind of relative, and all of these things are relative. Like saying 18 database queries just for outputting a bit of text is crazy, but on some other sites it might be 10, or on other sites with lots of plugins it might be 50. So you really have to kind of look at all of these together, I think.
Sure. There's another question in the chat. This one from John Donovan. Are the number of globals you have directly responsible for queries? Are the number of globals you have directly responsible for queries, obviously, but other performance factors?
Globals. Well, the thing about globals is that they're automatically populated for every page request. which makes sense. That's why they're globals and they're available in Twig, in your Twig templates without having to do anything. So do those have an impact on performance? Well, they definitely, there's definitely a database query to go fetch those globals. I don't know if I can just off the cuff do this, but there it is, I guess. Yeah. So this is, let me expand this a bit. This is the database query, I think. Yeah, it looks like it inner joins the global sets. I don't know if I even have any globals on this site. I guess I don't. No, I don't. So there's a database query. There's a single database query that I can see, which is saying, fetch all of the globals. So that is an extra database query. And I assume if I have a lot of global sets, and maybe if those global sets had related, no, I don't know if you could eager load relation fields on a global set. But to go back to the question, does it affect performance? Yes, probably minutely it does. Where I found globals really impact performance is when you're using caching, specifically if you're using Blitz, but probably also if you're using template caching. No, probably just Blitz. Because a global is available on every single page in every single template. Anytime a global is updated, you potentially have to purge the entire cache, right? Because you don't know where that global is actually used. It's different with an entry because if I go back to this slide here, so article with ID 999 doesn't appear here, right? So when I update that article in the CMS in the control panel, there's no need to refresh this cached page. However, if I update the global, whether or not I use that here, the cache will still need to be refreshed. So there are situations in which it'll have more of a performance impact, but in general, I think it'll be relatively negligent.
Okay, good.
I see a question by Steve, I think.
Yes.
But it's disappeared.
I've got it here.
Have you ever used select as array or any of the other element query modifiers to improve performance? And what's your kind of view on those?
Yeah. So the question is, if I ever used, so here, for example, we have .limit, .select, or .as array, which will help you to, well, .select will tell your element query to don't select all of the fields, just select the ones that I've told you to explicitly. And as array will say, don't give me back entries, but give me back an array of fields. So I do use those regularly, but only in plugins. I don't know if I've ever used them in Twig. It seems very low level to me to be using in Twig. And the difference is that you won't get an entry back. You won't get an element back often. And then in your code, you're not going to say entry. Well, you will say entry.title, I guess, if it's an array, but there are things there are behaviors that won't work as expected. And I guess another reason I would not use those in templates is, if another developer ever comes onto the project and is trying to work with code that I've written and their selects and as array and stuff like that, it's just, I can see myself having to write a lot of documentation within the template to explain why I've done it that way. Obviously, there are some performance benefits, like here I'm just outputting, let's say here I'm just outputting the entry title. So in theory, why do I need to get the rest of the fields? I could just say select title and just output that. Yeah, maybe. I personally don't do it because I think, well, if I'm working with entries, I want to be working with entry elements rather than an array. So I would just be careful with that. Maybe the labeling is maybe important. Like maybe it shouldn't be entries. Maybe it should be titles if you just got titles, or I don't know. But I would certainly put in a comment for the next developer. The next poor developer has to come and figure out why you've done it this way.
Yeah, I've used it in modules or plugins
Yeah.
before, much more so, because particularly if you're doing a lot of data manipulation, it can dramatically reduce the memory or the speed of it.
Yes.
When you're putting and manipulating a lot of data around.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And in plugins, I will do that a lot. Yeah, because yeah, sometimes you just want an array of IDs. So things like .column and there's .ids, which is really useful. There's actually a lot of helpers that come from Yi for manipulating the results of those queries. Okay, before it gets too late, I think I will move on because I do have a little surprise. This is something I've been working on for a while, and only a handful of people have seen this. So this is the first time it's been shown publicly. And it is called Sprig. So a reactive twig component framework. What the hell does that mean? So when we talk about components, this can be used in different ways depending on, you know, what language or framework you're talking about. But essentially, these are twig templates, maybe twig partials, and we'll often, you know, have an includes folder, and we'll include different twig templates. We have include, we have, what else? We have extends, and we have embed, if you're into that kind of thing. So you have these different ways of kind of fragmentizing or componentizing your twig templates, right? And that's, each person does it their own way. And we're quite used to doing that in Twig for Craft. But what I've noticed is that there are then front-end templating languages. So Vue.js will have components, and React has things like JSX. And if you're using these front-end frameworks a lot, what can happen is that you end up having template code in Twig, and then you duplicate that in your JavaScript framework and the front-end code. So you have code in two places, which is horrible, especially when it's, you know, client-side and server-side. So Sprig attempts to give you a framework for keeping all of that in one place, and that one place is the server-side using Twig. The second thing that Sprig attempts to do is give you reactive components. So when we think of reactivity, we think of things like Vue.js, maybe Alpine.js, which I'm very fond of. It's a great JavaScript library, React, etc. These big front-end frameworks. But what if you just want to fetch something with a quick AJAX request? You want to maybe load more entries, or you just want to get some search results, or any number of things. What are your options? Well, jQuery is the good old friend of ours all. I'm sure we've all worked with it before, but it seems to be out of fashion these days. You could reach for Vue.js or React, which the learning curve is fairly steep, I would say. And not only that, it can be overkill. And then somewhere in the middle, you have Alpine.js, which is really nice. It kind of allows you to have reactive elements without having to actually write JavaScript code. You just put those inline, kind of like Tailwind CSS. So with Sprig, it aims to fill both of those requirements, and sits, I guess it would sit somewhere between Alpine.js and Vue.js in terms of the technology. But the idea here is that you get to use the best of JavaScript without having to write any JavaScript. So allow me to show you more. So let's say we have a little search, and we're just searching the entries in the CMS. So this would be in our main template. and I just call sprig the function and pass in the path to a template. So this is, just think of this as an include, right? Include the function. Include is often written as a tag as well in Twig, but actually writing it as a function is the recommended way according to the docs. So this works very similarly. We just kind of include this, and here is the component that we're including. I put this in underscore components, but this can be whatever you want. You can call this includes or anything. And in here we have our search form, and here's our form. And down below, we're saying, well, if a query was passed in, go fetch all of the entries using this search query and output the titles. Now, a normal form would probably have a method and an action and all of that. Well, we can take that away, and just by adding the sprig attribute, we're going to make this form reactive. So that means that when I put something in, hit search, there is no page refresh, but we get our results straight away just by submitting that form. Let me show you that again. And let me show you what is going on behind the scenes. So hopefully you can see my network tab. Please do shout if you don't.
Yep, can do.
So SE hit the search, and boom, you probably hopefully saw that XHR request. And look at the result. Our result is exactly what went in. It's actually pure HTML, and we've just replaced this component with a fresh version based on what was passed in. So we're getting live results from the CMS just by adding this sprig attribute. Let me show you another example, and then we'll look at this in a bit more detail. So this is something, this will be very similar to before in terms of how it works. Just this time, instead of submitting a form, we're going to, so I add sprig to this directly to this input field. So I'm saying make this input field reactive. And the default trigger on reactive elements depends on the type of element it is. With a form, it'll be on submit. With an input field, it'll be on change, which means when I type something and then focus out, that's the trigger. I want to explicitly set it. So I do it with S for sprig, S trigger. So you're saying the trigger is when key up is activated and when the value has changed. And I don't want to replace the entire component. I want to set the target to, well, this div with ID results. I've also wrapped this in if not sprig request. That basically says only load this on the first, so the first time this is rendered. So like when we do the include. And here's the div that we're going to replace each time. So now we get the situation where I just have to, just tap the keyboard and on each key up, we get the results. So let's look at our network tab again. So you could add a debounce so that it waits until I stop typing. I haven't done it here. It's very easy to do. But we're just, each time I hit a key, we get this AJAX request, which is fired off. It's fired off to the sprig components render action. And I pass in whatever the value of whatever input fields are in here, which is, I passed in SE. We have some boilerplate, so it just keeps track of the template. And what we get back is pure HTML, and we swap that in. Let me show you one more example, because that was searching. This would be like if you have a listing of entries, you might have 10 entries, and then you have a load more button rather than using pagination. So what we get here is a situation where I just hit load more, and these are loading pretty fast, like 140 milliseconds. So I think anything under 100 milliseconds feels instantaneous. I don't know how the latency is on this call, but like there's a delay of I don't know, it's barely perceptible. Like it's too fast to have a spinner, right? A loading spinner, which is very easy to add as well. And you might be thinking, okay, great, you're just refreshing all of these each time. What happens when it gets to 1,000? But no, what we're actually doing is we're loading, the next one in. So So we don't get that performance hit of having to load all 5 in one go. We're just loading one more. And again, we just do that with some magic. Not even magic, it's very simple. We're just targeting that replace div. So we're actually targeting its own parent div. And we're saying swap the outer HTML. We're getting kind of into details here, but you can see that the logic, well, there's two things. The state, where's the state stored, and where does the logic happen? So a lot of the time with Vue.js, the state is in your component on the front end, and the logic happens in your methods there. Here we're able to use logic using good old Twig, because this is a Twig template. So we're able to increment the offset by 1 or whatever amount we want. We're able to, what was the other thing I want to say? Oh, and the state. The state is kind of wherever the user interaction last happened. So at the moment, if I just inspect this button, there should be a hidden input field. And we're saying, okay, the offset is now set to 5. And when I hit that, it'll be set to 6 and then 7. So when I'm here, my state is stored here in the front end in HTML elements. There's no JavaScript. There's no virtual DOM, like plain old HTML, and it works really well. When I send that request up to the component, now our state is here in Twig. It does its thing. It sends the response back to us, and now we have the state back in our HTML. There's one more piece to this, which I think is really exciting as well. So far, I've been always targeting a Twig template, but it is possible to also create a PHP class. This means that I can perform my logic using PHP, not just Twig. This means that I can do things with APIs or whatever logic it is, but process that in PHP rather than Twig without having to create a plugin, without having to create a module. I just create this PHP class. It needs to have this namespace and be in this folder. It extends the sprig base component, which just gives it some base methods. And then I can define these public properties, which are populated from whatever is submitted here. I can associate it with a template simply by defining that here. So this is our kind of component template down here. And then I can define as many public methods as I want. So here, for example, we have a contact form. And when this form is submitted, I want to send this off to some email API. I want that to do the sending for me. And it'll just tell me if it was a success or not. And then my component gets re-rendered. So if I hit send, boom, oh, there's an error. So we went, if success, that evaluated to false. So we went in here and we found that there was an error. So we output that. But again, like no page request, we just get boom, and it comes back to us, the entire component, and we just replace that in, which happens extremely fast. And of course, when this does succeed, thank you for getting in touch. And that's just one example of how you can make these reactive or interactive components very easily. And the beautiful part of this is we're fully taking advantage of what JavaScript brings to the web, but we're not having to write JavaScript. So those are my examples. I thought of like creating some like demo website where I use all of these components, and I was like, oh, but time is finite, so I'm not going to do that. But what I will do, just to show you, actually I've already opened here, don't I? Yeah. Is just show you that this pattern is not something new at all. And I should say Sprig is entirely inspired by Laravel Livewire. So if you've heard of that or if you've played with it, yeah, this is fully inspired by that. But this is specific to craft, and I've gone for, you know, developer experience and flexibility at the same time, because what you can do with this is pretty crazy. But I also want to show you that this pattern is not something new. So if we over in GitHub, I'm going to open the network tab with XHR, which is the Ajax requests. And I'm just going to hover over this. Oh, something happened. What's this? Okay, so as I hovered over the branch, we got back this HTML, which when I click on it is this. Yeah, so just hovering over this did exactly what Sprig is doing, but this is GitHub, right? Also, if I go over here, actually, I wanted to show you a different repo, just because there's a few more contributors here. I'll clear the network tab. So I'm going to hover over contributors, and it's loaded all of the contributors with an Ajax request. We don't. I think it's it's in a template tag, so we're not seeing the preview. But here's the HTML that gets output there. And I actually want to show you something interesting. If I switch to slow 3G, so we're kind of throttling the network, so it's going to slow everything down. And I'll go back over there, hover over here. Oh, it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Because I'm demoing it. Let me do that again. So if I hover over this, oh, something's different. GitHub updated their site in the last 24 hours. Okay, I can deal with that. So, but again, just an Ajax request. This is using something called pjax, and it means that every time I go hover over contributors, this is strange because this is not what I was seeing literally this morning. I was seeing a bit of different behavior, but that's okay. They're improving their algorithms all the time. But what we're seeing is that the latest contributors, and those are not loaded, those are not populated on page load, only when I request those. And you can think of that similar to how we were eager loading. You know, these are not being eager loaded because most of the time you're not going to be, you know, asking who are the contributors for this. But when you do, those get populated through this Ajax request. And there are like multiple, this is being used all over the place. If I go here to issues, I'll clear this, and I hover over one of these issues, I get this kind of hover card thing. But I don't know if you're noticing it, but there's a small delay while those are being loaded in through Ajax. Right, so this pattern is being used all over the place on GitHub. And I don't know about you, but GitHub to me, like I would describe it as part website, part web app, because it has, it feels like a website, you know, when I navigate to a different page, it literally is a page refresh and a new page. But there are elements like this where I feel like, yeah, it's kind of web appy. I can do stuff like this, and I can see if I hover over this person, I can see, okay, that's not very insightful. Okay, so I can see some details about me. And again, I mean, this is loaded through an Ajax request. So point being, if GitHub's doing it, it must be cool. And no, endless possibility. I really see endless possibilities for this. And this is in pre-release stage, but next week it will be released into beta. Oh, and it's free. I didn't mention that. Free open source.
Very cool. One question from Sebastian in the chat. So how would you go about adding animations?
Okay, so if you can do it with CSS, so if you're talking about CSS animations, then I haven't really gone into detail about how Sprig works under the hood, but it uses a JavaScript library called HTMX, which takes care of the targeting, the swapping, the Ajax calls. Like for me, the beautiful part about Sprig is that I haven't had to write a single line of JavaScript code either. It's using this library, which is it's in early development, but it's the successor to something called Intercooler, which has been around for a while. But long story short, it allows you. So I've shown like sTarget, swap. I didn't talk about what those do, but you can assign CSS classes to elements when they're in a loading state. So you can do things like spinners and loading states, but also once they've been swapped in, you can give them a class. And provided you're talking about CSS animations, you can make those happen just using plain CSS, really. And that's one thing I really like about Sprig. We're not using any JavaScript magic. We're using good old HTML attributes. Granted, they're custom attributes, but still. And we're using CSS classes. It's probably happening too fast to show you. Let me see if we can see this. Yeah, so I don't know if you see this. It might be too fast. But when I click on the Load More button, here it is down here. And I'm just going to click on it, and maybe you'll catch it. So it now gets a different class, HTMX request, but you can change that class. So you can do different things in the loading state, and once it's been replaced, you can give it a different class and do anything you want, really, in CSS, including animations.
I did manage to find a link on that HTMX. I posted the HTMX site. There is a sort of examples animation section on there.
Yeah, if you're interested in what Sprig can do in terms of swapping out and all of the manipulation of HTML, then go look at HTMX. And this has this examples page. Lazy loading is something I kind of showed, but the one that was it this one, animations? Delete me. Yeah, so that's kind of a fade out animation. Here's a fade in. What's this? Okay, there was no animation there. Yeah, but there's different animations you can do here. Some of them, yeah. So some of them here, for example. Oh yeah. It's just using classes. But the other thing you can do is you can put these kind of descriptors on the classes. So you're telling this to. Well, I'm not sure. I think you're saying delay it by 1 second. So after it's been clicked, no, I'm not sure what it's doing even. This avoids flickering. But there are different. You can delay things. You can manipulate how these classes are applied. Yeah. So these examples are really interesting. And anything you can do with HTMX, you can do with Sprig. So they, this has been around a bit longer, not that much longer. I think it was made public in March of this year, but it's under really active development and already got a good community around it. And it means that unlike Livewire, which with Livewire, Caleb Porzio did an amazing job on that, but he's written all of the front end code, and he's written all of the back end code, and all of the middleware code, which is good for him because it means he can, he can make it very performant and very extendable, very customizable. I just want to deal with the craft side of things and let HTMX handle the front end side of things and have a very easy developer experience and way of writing the code. So I think, my opinion is that it works very nicely with the way that we're accustomed to working with Twig templates already. That's my hope, at least. So if anybody, like I said, it's going to be officially released next week. But if you want an early look and play, or if you have like a project that you really need this on, by all means, please do go install it and start using it and give me any feedback. So what is it? Put your lights on /craft-sprig, and you can already come here. I'm working on the documentation page. It's not yet public because there's a lot of demos and stuff on there, but you can already install it and start using it, and message me. Like if you want access to the docs, I'll gladly give it to people. Yeah, and then next week it'll be public anyway.